She didn't scream. She didn't curse, yet all of heaven heard when Hannah prayed. She was just one among many women in Shiloh. Her face didn't stand out. Her name didn't open doors, but something deep inside her carried a cry the world couldn't see. With every feast, every offering, every smile from Peninnah, something silently tore within her soul. Have you ever felt like that? As if the world kept moving forward while your pain was left behind, hidden, clenched between your teeth and the tears no one sees? What if your most desperate prayer was actually the beginning of an answer that would change the destiny of a generation? The dry wind blew between the tents. The women laughed among themselves, surrounded by children, like fruit trees in full season. But Hannah was barren. And in that culture, barrenness wasn't just the absence of children. It was a public mark of invisibility for a woman, and to many, even a sign of being rejected by God. Hannah's story begins in this abyss. Not one of sin, but of silence. Not one of rebellion, but of an emptiness even she couldn't name. Peninnah, her rival, provoked her daily. Her husband, Elkanah, though he loved her, couldn't grasp the depth of her sorrow. He would say, "Why are you weeping, Hannah? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" But there are wounds even human love can't heal. There, in the midst of the religious celebrations, Hannah's heart bled. The temple, meant to be a refuge, felt distant, and God seemed silent. There was no angel, no dream, no voice, only the weight of years without an answer. But it's in that place that one of the most powerful prayers in the Bible is born, and it wasn't spoken out loud. There were no signs to follow. It was made in silence. She rose, not because she felt well, but because she refused to accept that pain would be her final destination. Hannah didn't know it yet, but in that moment, her decision was about to become the first step toward the miracle of faith that would change her life and Israel's history. She walked to the temple, alone, with eyes swollen from crying and feet weary from waiting. She brought no gift, no burnt offering, only a soul laid bare before God, because sometimes it's in the silence of the soul that the deepest vows are born, the kind that can't fit into words but reach the heart of heaven. And while everyone else celebrated, Hannah poured herself out. She wasn't just asking for a child, she was searching for meaning, a spiritual purpose that would give her pain a reason. She wanted more than comfort, she longed for transformation. She had no idea that her lonely moment was actually the beginning of God's promise, because where the world sees barrenness, God sees invisible seeds, and where man sees an end, He plants eternal beginnings. The temple was empty, but Hannah's heart overflowed. Silent tears streamed down her face. Her lips moved, but no sound could be heard. She stood there before the altar, yet it wasn't the altar that held her up, but what she carried within. A pain so deep it could no longer be contained in silence. She wasn't just seeking comfort anymore, she was seeking God. The Bible says she prayed in bitterness of soul. It wasn't a memorized prayer or filled with formulas. It was a powerful prayer, made with what she had left. Open wounds, dying hope, and a faith that, though faint, still refused to be extinguished. How many times do we pray expecting an immediate answer, and when nothing changes, assume God has ignored us? But Hannah didn't give up. Even with no sign, she dared to do something that would change her story. She made a vow that pierced through the heavens. She said, "Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look upon the affliction of your servant and give your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life." She gave before receiving. She surrendered before conquering. What kind of faith is that? It's the kind that understands the miracle of faith is not just in receiving what we ask, but in giving back with gratitude what we've received. The priest Eli watched her from a distance. He heard no words, only saw her lips moving and her face distraught. And for a moment, he mistook the sacred for madness. He accused Hannah of being drunk, but she didn't lash out. She answered with humility and courage, "No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or strong drink. I was pouring out my soul before the Lord." Eli moved, stepped back, and instead of judgment, he offered a blessing. "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." That was the first turning point, because something in Hannah changed, even if her womb hadn't. She got up, no longer weeping as before, not because she was pregnant. She didn't know that yet, but because something had already been conceived inside her: trust. She had touched heaven with her heart, and even without seeing the outcome, she felt heard. Her vow had already become a seed in the spiritual realm. This is the power in Hannah's story. It reminds us that faith is not a feeling, it's surrender. That there are moments when the answer hasn't come, but our spirit finds rest because we trust the one who hears even what we cannot say. And if you've ever prayed with a soul torn open, you know what that feels like. When words fall short, but heaven understands the cry. When the heart lays itself bare before God, without guarantees, without reservations, clinging only to the hope that the Father still responds to those who trust. If you believe that vows made before God change destinies, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share this story. Because stories like Hannah's are still unfolding, and they cannot stop here. Every time someone kneels and offers more than words, they offer their heart. God's promise to Hannah still echoes in all who truly surrender. And as she returned home with a changed countenance, heaven was already quietly weaving the invisible, because what was spoken in secret at the altar was about to be revealed in the womb, and what seemed like mere pain was, in truth, the beginning of a divine purpose. Time passed. The sky, once silent, now whispered hope. And then, in the hidden place of the womb, something began to grow. Hannah conceived. After years of waiting, humiliation and tears, the invisible became tangible. The miracle of faith took on flesh. The barren woman now held a child in her arms, not just a baby, but a living answer. His name would be Samuel, because as she declared, "I asked him of the Lord." But there was something even deeper than the birth. The true labor didn't happen in the body, it happened in the spirit. Hannah didn't just conceive a child, she had birthed a new season. God's promise had been fulfilled. But the greatness of this story isn't just in the answer received, it's in what Hannah did afterward. Because she didn't cling to the miracle like one holding onto their last breath. She remembered. She remembered the altar, the pain, the vow made through tears. And when the boy was weaned, she prepared him to be given back. Imagine the heart of this mother, holding in her arms the one born from so much weeping and still willing to let him go, not because she loved him less, but because she understood. What is born in response to a powerful prayer doesn't belong to the vanity of the moment, but to the eternity of God. This is the second great turning point in Hannah's story. Most of us celebrate when the blessing arrives. Few are ready to release it. Hannah was, and that's what made her extraordinary. Because her faith wasn't in the child, it was in the God who gave him. She didn't bargain with God. She didn't ask for more time. She didn't hesitate. She took Samuel, prepared an offering, and went up to Shiloh. The same place where she had once wept would now become the place of her greatest surrender. The decision wasn't forced. It was voluntary. The boy was healthy, beautiful, full of life. He could have been his mother's pride in Ramah. But she understood the spiritual purpose was greater than personal comfort. Hannah didn't just want a child, she wanted her life to echo into eternity. And by giving Samuel back, she sealed that legacy. Here we grasp the depth of her faith. Faith that isn't possessive. Faith that doesn't use God as a means to personal fulfillment, but sees him as the altar on which everything received can be laid down again. There was no audience, no trumpets, just an ordinary woman, a small boy, and an altar. But all of heaven leaned in to watch. And then she said, "For this child I prayed, and the Lord hath granted me my petition. Therefore I have also given him to the Lord." And she gave him, not out of obligation, but out of love. Because true faith is expressed in absolute trust, even when the heart feels like it might break. There ended a cycle of tears and began a new cycle of destiny. Samuel would not just be a son. He would become a prophetic voice, a bridge between eras, a seed that sprouted from the womb of a woman who chose to believe and to fulfill her vow. And maybe you are living that moment now, the moment when God says yes, but is your heart ready not just to receive, but to consecrate? The miracle of faith doesn't end with the blessing. It continues through the surrender. Hannah understood. That's why her story didn't stop at a birth. It became a spiritual movement that would echo for generations. Because when God says yes, He's not just answering a request. He's opening a path for the invisible to become eternal. Samuel was still a child when he was left at the temple. His hands didn't yet know how to wield a sword, nor could his voice yet discern prophecy, but his heart already carried a calling that would outlive time. Hannah brought him to Eli, the same priest who once misunderstood her and gave him over with peace in her soul. The same altar that had been the stage of her agony now became the cradle of a nation's hope. Eli received the boy, perhaps still confused, perhaps still unable to grasp the fullness of what was unfolding. But Hannah didn't need people to understand her faith. She only needed to obey, because when a powerful prayer is answered, the response no longer belongs to our desires, but to the will of God. There began a new season. Hannah returned home without the child she had longed for, but she didn't return empty. She returned full of purpose. She hadn't lost Samuel, she had planted him. And when a mother plants a child at the altar, she isn't giving up a future. She's shaping the spiritual purpose of a generation. As the temple halls witnessed the boy's first steps, heaven was already writing new chapters for Israel. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Eli's sons, who were supposed to be spiritual heirs, were corrupting the sacrifices, dishonoring the altar, and turning worship into a hollow routine. But among them grew a boy whose mother had prayed for him with tears. A boy not born of tradition, but of faith, not of chance, but of God's promise. This is where Hannah's story becomes a seed for generations. The miracle wasn't just in giving birth, it was in giving Israel a new direction. And it all began with an ordinary woman who had the courage to surrender what most would never dare let go. Year after year, Hannah returned to Shiloh, but she never wavered in her vow. She didn't try to take Samuel back. Instead, she brought him robes sewn with love, watched from a distance, and kept her heart steady in surrender. This reveals the kind of faith Hannah lived. Not momentary faith, but enduring faith. The kind that, even after the blessing, continues to trust in the God who gave it. Each year, Hannah's presence brought more than new garments. It brought the living memory that everything began with a powerful prayer, spoken at a time when no one saw her. But God heard her. Her faithfulness was constant, her surrender daily, her memory sharp. Hannah didn't just pray. She remained, and that's what makes her story a model for us all. Samuel began hearing God's voice while still a boy, and as the sound of the word returned to Israel, Hannah may have been at home, unaware that her son would become the prophet who would anoint kings, confront Saul, and discern the voice of heaven when even the priests had gone astray. All because a woman understood that what is born of faith must be guided by the Spirit. All because an ordinary mother had the discernment to see that the miracle of faith doesn't end at birth. It blossoms in consecration. Can you feel the weight of that surrender? Imagine the letting go, the silence in the room, the absence of a child's laughter, and yet the peace. Because when there is purpose, the emptiness doesn't ache like loss. It resonates like mission. And perhaps that is Hannah's greatest legacy, to show us that faith is not a fleeting emotion. It is a firm decision, that the true act of worship isn't always in singing but in surrender. and that the altar never consumes in vain what is laid upon it with sincerity, because when faith meets God's timing, even pain becomes a generation, and when an ordinary woman moves in obedience, heaven plants eternal harvests. After the surrender, there was no lament, no suffocating nostalgia, no veiled regret. What flowed from Hannah's lips was worship. It wasn't a shallow reaction, but an eruption from the depths of someone who had experienced heaven touching earth. The pain that once cried in silence now danced in praise. Hannah prayed, but this time her powerful prayer didn't plead or beg. It gave thanks, it exalted, it declared. Her words became a song that would echo for centuries and is still read today as one of the most prophetic prayers in the Bible. My heart rejoiceth in the Lord, mine horn is exalted in the Lord, my mouth is enlarged over mine enemies, because I rejoice in thy salvation. She wasn't just a grateful woman, she was a soul overtaken by revelation. Hannah realized that what she had experienced wasn't just a personal miracle, but a divine movement. Her story wasn't only about her, it was part of something far greater. She sang as one who sees the invisible, and what she sang reached far beyond her own life. Hannah spoke of thrones being toppled, of the poor being lifted up, of the proud being silenced. She described not just a human reality, but a spiritual realignment. Her praise was charged with divine justice, a song that challenged systems. This is where Hannah's story takes on eternal proportions, because her praise didn't just celebrate the birth of Samuel, it celebrated the God who casts down and lifts up, who closes and opens, who silences and exalts. Hannah understood what many still don't, the spiritual purpose behind the pain. What once seemed like the desperate cry of a barren woman now unfolds as an eschatological vision. Her spirit had become a vessel for prophecy. Centuries later, Mary, upon conceiving Jesus, would sing a song with the same spiritual tone. The Magnificat, as it's known, feels like an extension of Hannah's hymn. The words echo, the themes repeat, as if the same breath that inspired Hannah had also reached Mary. This was no coincidence. It was fulfillment. The promise of God that began with an unknown woman in Shiloh stretched through generations. Hannah, without knowing it, was singing what heaven had already decreed, that the kingdom would come, not through the strong, but through the humble. That God's justice isn't built on titles, but on surrendered hearts. Her song is also a reminder to all of us. How often do we seek answers, but forget to turn our victories into worship? Hannah teaches us that every miracle of faith must be translated into praise, because God doesn't bless us just to satisfy us, but to reveal His glory. And most striking of all, Hannah's song doesn't focus on Samuel. She doesn't exalt the child or recount the process. She exalts God alone. That is spiritual maturity. She understood that the focus was never the blessing, but the blesser. When she finished her prayer, it wasn't just Hannah who had changed. Something in the spiritual atmosphere had been stirred. The woman who once wept in silence was now prophesying aloud. And her song continues to echo in every heart that chooses to trust before seeing, to surrender before possessing, to praise before understanding. Because when faith becomes worship, heaven shows up. And when prayer becomes song, eternity responds. Hannah thought her miracle had a name, Samuel. But God is not confined to the first yes. He is the God who multiplies when the heart is wholly surrendered. And so, after placing her son on the altar, Hannah returned home and conceived again. 3 sons, 2 daughters. The womb once labeled barren now brought forth life, as if heaven itself were answering her faithfulness with abundance. God was not in debt to her. He didn't just give back, He expanded. Because faith that surrenders always reaps a harvest. And Hannah's offering wasn't a loss, it was a seed. Heaven answered not only with Samuel, but with an entire family. In this, Hannah's story became a living testament to the cycle of honor. She honored God with her vow, and God honored her with fruitfulness. But the greatest gift wasn't just in the multiplied children, it was in the deep awareness that the spiritual purpose of her life had been fulfilled. She wasn't just the mother of Samuel, she was a vessel for a new season in the nation. And that impact couldn't be measured with human eyes. Because when God moves, he goes beyond expectation, beyond logic, beyond the moment. The powerful prayer she had once prayed through tears didn't end with a birth. It became a continuous thread in God's unfolding revelation to Israel. The boy prophet grew, heard the voice of the Lord, and was already being recognized as heaven's spokesman. And it all began with a cry no one heard, but God never ignored. How many of us pray thinking that the first answer is the end? Hannah shows us that with God, the first answer is only the beginning. The miracle of faith is not a period, it's a comma in God's story. A reminder that what is planted on the altar yields a harvest that spans generations. Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord, and with him, something even deeper grew. The quiet reflection of his mother's faith. Hannah was no longer in the temple, but she was present in his conscience, in the way he listened, in how he responded to the call of God. Hannah's story didn't end with her act of surrender. It began there, in the place where human eyes could no longer see, but heaven kept recording. Because true faith doesn't need a stage, it shapes destinies in the unseen. And it was in the unseen that Hannah taught Samuel to hear God before speaking to men. From an early age, he learned that the voice that truly matters is the one that comes from above. There's no mention of long conversations between them, but the fruit of Hannah's spiritual guidance is clear in every prophetic decision her son made. The powerful prayer she once prayed still echoed, not in words, but in direction, in character, in spiritual sensitivity. That is the highest spiritual purpose, to influence without controlling, to guide without restraining. Hannah knew how to let go, but what she left behind remained. That is the invisible legacy of faith, to turn the unseen into something eternal. If this story spoke to your soul, don't keep it to yourself. Share what God stirred in your heart. Send it to someone who needs a reminder that the promise is still alive. Subscribe now to the channel and keep listening to stories that heal, restore, and awaken faith. And leave your like as if saying, I believe heaven still answers. Stories like Hannah's can't stop at a screen. They need to reach other souls, and you are part of that.